Hi everyone, it's really great to be here and have the opportunity to hear all these papers. I've enjoyed so much so far. So beginning this second session is Carla Baute. Carla is currently a PhD candidate in history at the University of Campinas. She also has a MA and a BA in history. Her research interests are intellectual history, materialist cultural criticism, Marxism, Raymond Williams, and Latin American intellectual history. And we have a list of Carla's publications on the website, so you can go and see those there. As has already been noted, Carla also spent a period as a visiting researcher at the university. Today, Carla is presenting a paper titled Across the Atlantic, a research itinerary of Raymond Williams' reception in Latin America. If you've got any questions after listening to this paper, please leave them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get round to them at the end of the session. So over to you, Carla. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. I would like to start by sharing my screen. Just a sec. Is everyone seeing my screen? No? Just a second, please. Have fun. Sorry, everyone. My Mac seems to get a little problem here. Just a sec, please.
Tem outro, tem outro. It's still not sharing, Carla. We could ask Anna to go first if you need some time.
Yeah, perhaps that, because I really do need to share my screen, because I pretend to share some graphs and stuff.
Sure. Well, what you could do is, if it's a PowerPoint, you could send it over to me if you like.
All right.
Maybe use WeTransfer if it's large, and then I can share it from here.
Okay, I can do that. Maybe Anna could go first.
Yeah.
And then I try to make. Yeah.
Anna, are you happy to go?
Sorry for the inconvenience.
No, that's fine. So Eve, back to you.
Okay, so we have a paper now from Lucia Teixeira. Anna holds a PhD in sociology of culture from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's an associate professor of sociology at the Federal University of Sao Paulo and vice president of the Research Committee 37, Sociology of Arts of the International Sociological Association. She has published widely, and again, a list of those publications can be found on our website. Today, Anna will be presenting a paper titled A Lesson from Raymond Williams, the theoretical challenge posed to the left of the 21st century. And if you have any questions for Anna, please leave them in the Q&A section or in the chat. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Daniel Williams and Evie Johnson and all the organizers of the Brazil Symposium program. This is a very special occasion, and I'm actually very grateful to be part of it. Thank you very much. After being confined for so long and watching our social and political space collapse like it is right now, I'm a bit like Professor Maria Elisa Sevasco. when I'm among such dear friends, I feel like I'm going to cry, so I have to hold myself. Well, I'd like to start with a question that has been taken center stage in discussions on culture within the left. I would indicate the problem initially as a kind of colonization of the aesthetic plan by political questions of self-evident importance. At least in the Brazilian context, and I believe not only there, absolutely everything seems to have been captured by a political reading that frequently, as shallow and unprepared as it could be, sterilizes the very idea of politics and its analytical efficacy. It is certain that we are yet to create the analytical tools that will help us understand the current moment, which in a way frightens us, challenges us, but I hope it will not silence us. While we see the values that define the very idea of university and knowledge, values such as freedom, the right to have rights, the protection of life, etc., being treated as a disposable program that would hide the deleterious practices of supposed terrorists disguised as professors, we witness social movements that are contemporary to it, assuming the protagonism of the left from categories operated in a self-evident way, which promise and seem to be fulfilling the emptying of the social class meanings that marked the debate of the left to pave its own political space, based above all on identity categories. Attempts at the intersection between art and politics have multiplied before our eyes, proliferating the following movements: women's art, feminist art, paintings performed by women, for women, performed by women. We see carnival parties led by women for a female audience, Black art, Black women art, LGBTQA+ art, and its numerous subdivisions. With this multiplication of phenomena and their respective denominations, it seems impossible for the cultural researcher at this moment not to deal with the political dimension of cultural production in a way or another. Williams was one of the cultural theorists most expressly interested in involved in the political life, not only of his country, but of the world in the 20th century. Prominent in this type of Williams' performance, for example, is the May Day Manifesto, a text he signed with Stuart Hall and Edward Thompson in 1967 and published by Penguin in 1968, a pivotal year for thinking about the intersection between politics and culture. John and Lizzie Eldridge pointed out the convergence of several of Williams' political concerns in the constructions of this text. His disillusionment with the Labour Party, his clear and reaffirmed position against Stalinism, as much as against what at the time was called American imperialism, and his open defense of the unilateral disarmament of the Western Bloc. Williams has no doubts as to the possibility and even the ethical duty of the intellectuals' participation in the political life of his country, his state, his continent, in short, at the level in which political relations would gain concrete efficacy. For this very reason, it makes no sense to seek in Williams' analytical work the defense, for example, of a watertight separation between science and politics, as Weber did, for instance, for whom these two spheres are configured as diverse and autonomous ones, governed by entirely different gods. Far from this, he will bring his political concerns into the analysis, enabling categories until then foreign to literary analysis and in an intellectual space strongly dominated by the tradition of the work of I.A. Richards and F.R. Leaves, authors from whom, especially in Leaves' case, culture is a high symbolic substratum proper to an organic community, which can only be properly analyzed and supported by an intellectual elite. According to John and Lizzie Eldridge, and now I'm quoting, Liv's plan was a contemporary revision of a project initiated in the English case by Samuel Coleridge and developed by Matthew Arnold, the establishment of a stratum of self-provided cultural intellectuals, a clerisy. This is the end of the quotation. The very notion of culture woven into Williams' works, the place where the author collects a significant part of his objects of interest, is considerably more complex than that which dominates the academic space of the time. As an expression of an organic community, Liv's conception of culture suppresses from the analytical field the perception of the break, the rupture, the conflict, the inequality. In short, the class struggle, which Williams readily refuses. His perspective of culture is entirely different, for he assumes the possibility of vertically crossing all social strata in its symbolic dimension, which evidently implies a widening of the spectrum of events enabled within the insignia of culture that deserves the investigator's attention, without, however, losing sight of the creative dimension of culture, so that the emancipatory normative criteria surrounding it are not dissolved, which naturally comes accompanied by an original and promising methodological frame. It is, therefore, not possible to consider that Williams simply expands a universe of phenomena that was circumscribed to the universe of high culture, to give it a more anthropological formulation, based on the assumption that every social group, whatever its position, is part of culture, which as such deserves to be known. Paul Jones highlights the misunderstanding implicit in this reading, often marked by the removal of Williams' famous phrase, culture is ordinary, from its context of formulation. Jones tells us, and now I'm quoting, the expansion usually attributed to Williams seems quite straightforward, from a narrowly aesthetic confinement to a widened anthropological reach, culture as a whole way of life. One of Williams' most famous phrases from his early work, taken from the essay of 1958, seems to sum this perspective up: culture is ordinary. This is the end of quotation. Jones refers here to the following extract from Williams, and now I'm quoting Williams. Culture is ordinary, that there is no a special class or group of men who are involved in the creation of meanings and values, either in a general sense or in specific art and belief. Such creation could not be reserved to a minority, however gifted, and was not even in practice, so reserved. In talking of a common culture, then one was saying first that culture was the way of life of a people, as well as the vital and indispensable contributions of specially gifted and indefinable persons. And one was using the idea of the common element of the culture, its community, as a way of criticizing that divided and fragmented culture we actually have. This is the end of quotation. This interpretation, according to Jones, obliterates the creative dimension of culture, which is fundamental in Williams' set of concerns, precisely because it is in it that lies the emancipatory path of culture and learning with which Williams engaged through his life. Here, it's important to highlight the double dimension of the notion of culture formulated by Williams, returned to the same essay of 1968, and I'm quoting Williams again. We use the word culture in these two senses, to mean a whole way of life, the common meanings, to mean the arts and learning, the special process of discovery and creative effort. Some writers reserve the word for one or other of the senses. I insist on both and on the significance of their conjunction. This is the end of the quotation. The maintenance of the two dimensions of the notion of culture formulated by Williams is important because it allows, in Jones' terms, and I'm quoting Jones, his dual purpose use of category and related formulations as a means of construction a critical emancipatory social norm, and as a means of empirical assessment against that norm. And B, the second overlapping criterion derives from his view, and that while cultural democratization did entail the erection of the elitism of the various minority/mass formulations, it did not entail equalizing all existing cultural acts as if they were of equal qualitative aesthetic merit. This is the end of quotation. This imposes naturally not only an expansion of the analytical spectrum, but fundamentally an adequacy of method. The perspective of a timeless, somehow original, integrated and harmonical community on which Levy's conception of culture was based, dissolves in this new analytical space, finally open up to the possibility of division, breakdown, and conflict, but moreover, of the creative expression of still emerging social forces contained in the complex notion of the structure of feeling. Williams' method thus provides us tools for understanding social change. The Long Revolution is a fundamental work for understanding this step in Williams' work, because it is the work in which the notion of culture unfolds not in two, but in three articulated levels, without, in so doing, coalescing into a whole devoid of conflict. The plane of culture is subdivided there in three dimensions. The first one, the lived culture organized in a whole in such a way that the analysis of the culture expressions leads to the understanding of his whole, in the context of a theory of culture as the study of relationships between elements in the whole way of life. This is a kind of analysis of culture, attempt to discover the nature of the organization, which is the complex of this relationships analysis of particular works or instructions. And it is in this context analysis of their essential kind of organization, the relationship which works or institutions embody as parts of the organization as a whole. These are words from Williams. This was a small quotation. Second, the second sense of the notion of culture is a documental set. That is, as the set of works of aesthetic and intellectual creation that have recorded aspects of the experience of a given social group, including popular literature published in periodicals, as well as other forms of popular expression, in an analysis that requires specialized critical work. And the third sense, it means culture as a selective tradition, one that selects from among that has been documented and filtered the highest and most timeless values for which a status of universality is claimed. Here there is a tapering movement that leads to the construction of the object to be analyzed. Within the scope of a certain lived culture, a certain documentary mass is established where the structure of feeling that Williams is interested in analyzing resides, and only on this basis can a selective tradition be constituted. This is the key to Williams' perspectives, which completely dissolves the assumption of a high culture that dominated the English scene of the time. Jones points us to the precise aspect of the more properly democratic methodological formulation that Williams proposes for the analytical of culture. And this is Jones speaking. This recorded culture from which the tradition is selected is obviously identical to the documentary culture. This provides a methodological answer to the question of how Williams democratized his conception of culture, not by rejecting high culture for a low culture, or for an anthropological conception of all way of life, but by admitting all objectivated culture as documentary culture to the first stage of the reconstruction of a structure of feeling. This is the end of the quotation. In this sense, it is possible to say that Williams takes here a political methodological stance which respects the formal demands of knowledge production, affiliates to a traditional with academic institutional backing, but does so by deepening the possibilities of incorporating to the analysis the symbolic dimension produced in the sphere of the most different social groups, until then deprived of the plan of creative production which deserved specialized analysis. It is thus an effort to construct a method justified in the face of the formalized structure of knowledge that finds in the university its institutional space par excellence, which dismantles on the level of knowledge an inequality that outraged him politically and led him to establish a wide range of strategic actions: education, including adult education, the writing of manifestos, an interest in popular culture, and etc. Between these different actions, it is possible to trace without fear of error a line of political coherence. His analytical work, however, never shirked to task of theoretically formulating its objects of interest. This is Williams' lesson for the intellectual left of the 21st century, the recognition that sociological objects do not appear ready-made at the level of empirics, and that it's not the sociologist's duty to and that it is the sociologist's duty to formulate them theoretically and conceptually. However evident the inequality that provokes may be by themselves, such inequalities do not constitute a fully formulated sociological object, since the justness of a political cause is not by itself the reason for its theoretical pertinency, requiring the sociologist the magic of converting the former into the later. So that's what I brought to you today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, very, very suggestive in all kinds of ways. We'll listen to Carla as well, and then come back with questions for both. The universal and the particular in relation to culture is obviously a kind of theme there that picks up on some of what we heard earlier as well. Carla, so what's the state of play with your presentation? I've got the PowerPoint here. Do you want to try doing it from your computer first?
I can try first. I think I resolved the issue. It was a problem of security, something like that. I'm gonna try to share my screen. Now you see it?
Yeah, that worked. Well done.
Thank you. Sorry for the disturbance. All right, let's go. I would like to start my presentation by thanking the organizers of the Centenary Symposium, Professor Daniel Williams and Eve Johnson, as well as the other panelists. It is a pleasure to be here today. Well, it is without a doubt safe to say that Raymond Williams is one of the greatest cultural theorists to ever come out of Great Britain. Throughout the decades of his prolific career, he ventured into multiple territories and, while developing a solid body of work, made significant contributions to many areas. His influence can be felt in different parts of the globe, where interesting applications and developments of his concepts took place. It has reached São Paulo, Brazil, as I, then a history undergrad, came across his writings in the early 2010s. Later on my master's, I dedicated myself to better understand the formation and developments of his thinking through diachronic and synchronic analysis, mostly focused on culture and society and Marxism in literature, as well as on Williams's own intellectual connections. During that period, I was awarded an additional research grant within my research grant from Brazil and had the opportunity to stay at Swansea University, as a visiting researcher, as Daniel mentioned, under his supervision from September 2018 until March 2019. I've attended seminars led by Daniel and Professor Christy Bohata, with additional lectures by Professors Wynne Thomas and John Goodby. I also consulted Raymond Williams' papers at Richard Burton Archives. I would like to give a special thanks to Katrina Legg. I think she's participating in the symposium. And by consulting the archives, I incorporated its contents, some of the notebooks, correspondence, and other types of documents. And I think my thesis was profoundly affected in positive ways, I believe. And the whole experience has given me the confidence to continue my work on Williams and to take it to new and exciting directions. Hence, my presentation here today. Well, I would like to present a few aspects of my ongoing PhD research, now in its second year, supervised by Professor Silvana Rubino at University of Campinas. I'm analyzing the ways in which Williams's ideas had entered, circulated, and influenced diverse networks of intellectuals from the late 1970s to today, in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. Among the possibilities of approaching this topic, I choose to work mainly on two fronts. The first one being the examination of selected works by distinguished intellectuals from different areas within humanities and social sciences. And second, mapping the translations of Williams's books into Brazilian Portuguese and Latin American Spanish. Well, such an endeavor presents a double challenge of facing, on one hand, the task of understanding the international circulation of ideas among wide and diverse intellectual fields, while trying to grasp their articulations and developments. On the other hand, there is the undertaking of weaving this tangle of information into both qualitative and quantitative analysis. At the outset, it is important to recover some elements that preceded the proposed time frame, as I mentioned, from the late 70s on. I would like to highlight three distinct developments. The first one is the institutionalization and consolidation of humanities and social sciences in Latin America as academic subjects between the late 1800s and the 1930s. I am especially interested in the fields of sociology and literary criticism at this point. The second one regards the transformations that took place in the following decades, particularly in the field of sociology. And by that, I refer to significant movements in favor of empirical procedures in sociological research, and how this affected both the training of academic staff and the topics investigated by the scholars. And the third one, by the late 60s and into the 70s, the critiques of these overly scientific methods joined force with the leftover traces of essentialist practices of German and French origin. That resonated not only in sociology, but also in cultural criticism in general. Their joint information, these 3 points that I mentioned, provides possible clues to analyze the proximity and the tension between what can be called the scientific impulse and a profound aesthetic sensibility, as well as their impacts on the configuration of Latin American thinking of the period. The aspects mobilized by the critics were embedded by disputes among universities and institutes, and were mixed with turbulent political crises and dictatorships in the region. In that context, literary critics and social scientists engaged in wide-ranging ways in developing analytical practices that would incorporate the urgencies of their times and in attempts to respond to demands of social transformations. What I would like to point out with this background information is that I believe it helps to establish a research path. It also offers clues that are intended to follow in tracing over the coming years the different circumstances in which Raymond Williams' ideas found a fertile place in Latin America. I would like to elaborate a bit on the theoretical conceptions of my work. in my own practice of a sociologically oriented intellectual history, Pierre Bourdieu's theory of practice occupies a significant place. He was mentioned before by Hugo. In this specific research, the concept of field, academic field, and that argument of the social conditions of the international circulation of ideas drive this whole enterprise. Well, field can be roughly defined as a system of relations and disputes, structured spaces of positions that contain specific properties and struggles, gathering people and or institutions in their game. And that is shaped in different ways, in different periods, according to dispositions of this game. It is from this conception of a set of dialectically structured and structuring dispositions that I choose to examine the issue and trace Raymond Williams's reception. And with Renato Ortiz, I think that ideas travel and bring with them the foundation of the concept and the materiality of history. And in this process, there are losses and gains. That is why it is crucial to adjust the lenses to see different nuances and locate these elements properly. Well, what meaning, what function does a foreign work assume in a new land? What social operations are at stake? With Bourdieu, I think it is crucial to, and here I quote him, look at these selection processes and find out who these people doing the selecting actually are. Who are the discoverers and what interest do they have in discovering? Choices which seem pure of other interests and are mutually agreeable are often made on the basis of similar positions in different fields, and in fact correspond to homologous interests and styles where the international background or project is concerned, end quote. When we deal with the reception of foreign authors, readings from abroad can sometimes have a type of freedom that is absent from the national reading. Taking this into account, my work aims to analyze the gains that this liberation from national reading can bring, while examining also the configuration of different disciplines that unfold in symbolic limitations and impositions in different interpretations, and uses of Williams's thought in Latin America. For this reason, I believe it is also vital to pay special attention to the peripheral condition that Latin America has and occupies, and how this had had and still has an important role in shaping dispositions in the academic field. As I mentioned, I selected Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. The choice of Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico is related to the relevance and significance of the academic production from these countries, considered centers of educational excellence, Latin America. The choice of Colombia has to do with its strategic role in the reconfiguration of communication studies on the continent, which will play a very significant part in Latin American criticism from the 1990s on. Therefore, I have selected renowned intellectuals in their specific fields and who I think have made distinctive uses of Williams's concepts and contributed to reconfiguration in their own areas. As I mentioned, a survey of the works of these authors is being carried out, and the mentions of Williams's are verified. I mean, which books, which concepts are referenced, and with which other authors he appears alongside to in those books. And this information is being fed into a database that will be made into tables, graphs, etc. A few books and papers were selected for being outstanding in the career of such authors, as well as examples of how Williams's concepts are used in different approaches, and they will be analyzed in more depth in the dissertation. The authors are, from Argentina, Beatriz Sarlo, from Literary Criticism, and Carlos Altamirano, Sociology, with an emphasis on the period from the late 70s to the 2010s. From Brazil, Heloísa Pontes, from Anthropology, Marcelo Ridente, from Sociology, Maria Elisa Sevasco, from Literary Studies, and Sergio Micelli, from Sociology, with an emphasis on the period from the late 70s until nowadays. From Colombia, I selected Jesus Martín Barbero from Communication Studies, with an emphasis on the period from the late 80s to the early 2000s. Mexico, Nestor Garcia Conclini from Anthropology, from the 90s until today. As of now, I can go as much as to pinpoint the different decades in which references to Williams appear most. As the work progresses, it will be possible to link it to developments in the fields, and then to specific settings in each discipline. Even though it's an early investigation, I believe it's safe enough to point out that Punto de Vista Journal has had a leading role in introducing Williams in Argentina. Founded by Sarlo, Altamirano, and others, it ran between 1978 and 2008, and was one of the most important cultural journals in Latin America. The first mention was in an interview made by Sarlo with Williams and Richard Hogarth, published in July 1979. In its 30 years, there was a total of 7 articles with Raymond Williams on their titles, spanning throughout the decades. In Brazil, the first mention of Williams I could locate so far was in the 1972 book by Sergio Miceli entitled A Noite da Madrinha, The Night of the Godmother, in a free translation, a study about a popular Brazilian talk show and the growing cultural industry at the time. Williams' mentions do not feature in the contents of the book, but culture and society and the long revolution are listed as references. In Argentina, in as early as 1982, one can see some significant uses of Williams by Sarlo and Altamirano. In Brazil, this is only an event, a noticeable thing, by the 90s. Another aim of this research, as I said in the beginning, is the mapping of the translations of Williams's books into Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish. They relate to the appropriations of Williams's theory, the characteristics of the international circulation of ideas, and their impact on the publishing market. And when we talk specifically about the international circulation of ideas, it is essential to emphasize how it is highly hierarchical and driven by unequal exchanges. With Gisele Sapiro, Johan Heibron, and Maurício Bustamante, I understand the translation process as a way to measure international consecration, or as Bourdieu would call it, the accumulation of symbolic capital. 2 aspects should be emphasized here. First one, the peripheral position of Latin America and how this affects the flow of translations. That is, many more books are translated from English into Portuguese or Spanish than the other way around. And second, to understand the dynamics of translations, the space in which intermediaries, and I mean translators, publishers, critics, literary agents, it's important to see how they shape the demand. Only then, I believe, it is possible to think about specific settings and their interactions with particular historical conditions. I brought some preliminary data, from the research on Williams's translations into Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish. In this first graph, we can see that out of 36 books published by the author, fiction and nonfiction, 14 were translated to Portuguese, 39% of the total. In this other graph, we can see that out of the same 36 books, 15 were translated into Spanish, 42% of the total. If we break this data down by decades, we can see that Brazil started translating first, as early as 1960s. Between the 80s and the 90s, translations into Spanish were higher. Then Brazil surpassed it in the first decade of the 2000s. And later, in the 2010s, there was this increased flow of translations, as we mentioned in the previous session. In Brazil's case, I'm interested in understanding why some of Williams's books were translated into Brazilian Portuguese very quickly after the original publication in the 80s and the 70s, and why in that period they were published by big commercial publishers. That's a thing to notice. Followed by a slower pace during the 90s and the 2000s, and then as we mentioned also, in the 2010s, there was this big growth in publications done by a university publishing house. Well, with the databases concerning translations and references to Williams in the strategic areas I have mentioned, it will be possible to cross-reference the quantitative analysis and the qualitative analysis based by the literature, and then hopefully contribute to a field of studies that is still undeveloped, whether in Brazil or elsewhere. I intend to gather additional data relating to Raymond Williams' references in more recent works, such as MA thesis and PhD dissertations from different areas and organize it in charts, graphs, etc. That is if my deadline allows me, of course. About the circulation of Williams' ideas specifically, little has been published so far. I would like to mention the 2011 issue of Keywords Journal, a collection of articles edited by our very own Daniel Williams, entitled Raymond Williams in Japan. It features a few of next symposium, I think by the 22nd, the Japan symposium. And the topic of circulation appears discreetly, since it was mostly focused on cultural studies in general. I was able to find 2 papers that focus on Williams exclusively. In Keeping, who wrote the Chinese reception of Williams, wrote about the Chinese reception of Williams in literary studies in a paper from 2003, in which he traces some of Williams' translations and some uses of his concepts in China. And Clara Masnata, who published a paper entitled Raymond Williams in the South Atlantic in 2010. Masnata, when discussing particular uses of Williams in Buenos Aires and São Paulo, brings up interesting points, especially about the intellectual developments in Argentina around Punto de Vista that I have mentioned, and its leading figures, Sarlo and Altamirano, as well as discussing Sevascos para ler Raymond Williams, reading Raymond Williams. However, Masnata presents incorrect data regarding the translations in both countries, and with a very small sample of materials, jumps to conclusions full of generalizations and little depth. I have 2 examples of this. The first one, Masnata wrongly asserts that Brazil translated more books, which does not proceed from the data I collected. Second, from an analysis of just 1 book by 1 author, she claimed that the translations did not lead to creative applications of Williams's concepts in Brazil. That is quite a bold statement from such a small sample. What I propose is then a broader and deeper study that will result in a dissertation, through which I think it is possible, from Williams's tracks, to unveil the circumstances in which his ideas found simultaneously support and resonance in Latin America. At the same time, investigate developments in distinct areas, such as cultural criticism, sociology of culture, and cultural studies. These different areas of study have had a special relevance in the Latin American context in the last 4 decades. Their developments are directly related to a broader transformation in different forms of knowledge that go way beyond their borders. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. A very interesting paper that addresses in some ways some of the intentions of these symposia, I suppose, just in terms of thinking of Raymond Williams in different contexts and his reception in different contexts. Evoking Edward Said's essay on traveling theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that, from The World, the Text and the Critic, where he talks about Raymond a bit, but just the difference that the reception of a theory in a different national culture can have, which reflects on everything we've been doing today, I think. Great. Do we have questions? Please use the Q&A attendees. Alexandro has posted. Alexandro, do you want to speak your question rather than me? Can you, as you're amongst us here?
Okay, it's not a question, just a little commentary. So Anna and Carla, thank you very much for the exposition. Carla, your work is very important. I met Carla in one of courses of the post-graduation course at the Faculty of Education. Before going to Swansea, it's okay? Yeah. She also published a paper with us in occasion of the Williams Colloquium. So I'm happy without know about your work. Congratulations, Carla. Carla, just one comment. Are you familiar with Master's Iago about the reception of Williams in Brazil between 1969 and 2006? I don't know. Iago Malandrin, I'm sorry. Iago found 3,000 occurrences of Williams through at the university archives. Anyway, the dissertation, sorry, is valuable. And I also present a paper on Box in 2010 on Williams selection tradition in Brazil. Anyway, you are the scholar of the subject, but I can talk if you want.
Thank you, Alexandro. Carla, do you have any responses you'd like to make to that? Or just thanks?
I can comment a little bit. Thank you for the recommendations, Alexandro. I didn't know is it your student, Iago? Yeah. I'm gonna ask you his email later.
For me? Okay.
And I didn't know that you published something on the subject in 2018, you mean? I'm gonna look into it. And of course, all the contributions are most valuable to adding to my database and my research. Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you today.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting that the reception of Williams, has been a subject that is being looked into and has been looked at. Clearly, there's enough material there. Louise Baute asks a question here, a question for Carla. Could you please elaborate a little bit on the dynamics of translations? Your phrase, I think, Carla, as a way to measure consecration, especially regarding the roles of translators, publishers, critics, literary agents, etc., in the composition, in Bourdieu's terms, of a well-regulated ballet in which individuals and groups dance their own steps. So, yeah, the role of translation in, authorial prestige, I guess, in a way, is the question.
Can I respond now? Or
Yeah.
That's a nice question. I think the dynamics of translations are much more complex than if we just look at small samples of demanding groups. One might say they are important, the dynamics of small groups and how they can make efforts to translate a specific author or anything. But I believe that there, as I mentioned in my presentation, unequal flows of translations, and in certain times, a particular author is more translated into a language, and we can relate that to our previous discussion about the selective tradition. I think they can be put together, and it's interesting to use those in relation when we are researching this topic. And I think that, let me read one more time the second part of the question. Well, how that can result in a measurement of consecration. Well, Bourdieu discusses how sometimes an author, when he's little known and published only in his native language, he's known by selected few. I guess we can say that from Williams in the late 70s, early 80s, there was no translations of his books, then it's most postgraduate work, or as you say in English, graduate studies. But then when you have an effort of translation, that can go into undergrad studies and have a much more meaningful impact in the later generation. So it becomes more democratized, one can say. And then I believe that is the way we can measure consecration, when it's widely available in different languages. Williams has some of that, but I think that there's a lot of work to be done in the area. But I believe that one example of how translations relate to intellectual consecration are the example of the very own Bourdieu. He's one of the most translated authors. He's, I believe, only second to Michel Foucault in the list of the most quoted authors in humanities and social sciences. And he's widely translated. There's a few interesting works that I actually look up to with Giselle Sapiro and Johan Heiberholm, as I said in my presentation. They've made a lot of work in mapping the translations so they can see how social sciences has changed in the decades. So I think that this type of study it produces a fine line of data and analysis that can provide not only insightful observations, but also data for future researches. That's what I'm intending to do.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I guess that there's the act of translation, but then there's the reading of it, which has to happen as well. Back with the question of the selective tradition in a way.
I think that relates to the other part of my work that I've mentioned, that I want to examine how the concepts are used, how they're applied, even though they relate to or not to translations. Most of the times, the authors, the consecrated Latin American authors, they read it in English. There's not a translation barrier, if one can say, I think.
The quotation by Bourdieu that you put up in your slides, Carla, struck me as very close to what Anna was talking about in terms of the selective tradition and the selection of texts. I can't remember now exactly how you phrased it, Anna, but you were talking about the way in which or Raymond Williams was talking about the way in which a particular selection of texts, a tradition, makes itself appear universal. So the role of the critic then in some ways is to show actually it's not universal, it's particular, it's reinforcing the dominance of one group or one group just expressing its culture as being everyone's culture. And your paper seemed to be in some ways revolving around questions of, what is genuinely universal and what's particular. Do we want to do away with the universal in the form of, say, human rights or some of the things you were alluding to at the beginning? What's the relationship between a particularism, if you like, and then a claim for a broader universal culture? It seems to be a question that comes up a lot today in relation to identity politics, right, which is often kind of lamented, but perhaps is inevitable, be that feminism or indigenous politics or minority mobilizations of different kinds around sexuality or ethnicity. Any thoughts on that in relation to, well, the paper you gave and Williams's engagement with these issues?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Daniel. I'm glad you have asked that. What I would like to highlight with my paper is the fact that we've been watching the studies interested in this identities matter have been increased a lot in the late years. And I think, although they have this clear intention of transformation of problem that have been detected, they assume that the problem, if you have this problem and it is clear in the social world, so you already have a sociological object and you don't need to bother to elaborate it in a theoretical way, because if it is a social problem, obviously it is already a sociological matter. And I would like to point that the work of Raymond Williams, it leaves no doubt that although he was very interested in the praxis, in the transformation of the social world, he never left beside the need to elaborate it theoretically. On the contrary, he was a very sophisticated theoretical analyst. It was very important. So you probably cannot take a very interesting political tools from a work that was theoretically poor.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's this is the central part of my paper. And I'm not sure about the possibility to find these universal values in Raymond Williams' work. If you read Williams in those terms, I really would like to listen to you a bit more, because thinking of this filiation to the materialism, so the historical cut of the object is always so important that you cannot talk about something that is not historically located, historically elaborated. So it goes against any form of universal elaboration of the question, of the matter. But if it appears in his works, it's beyond my reading of his works, and I really would like to listen to you. And I would like as well just to ask something to Carla. I would like to know, Carla, if you think there is some more similarities between the way, in analytical ways, some more similarities between Bourdieu and Raymond Williams, because the way that Bourdieu looks to the work of art is very different from the way that Raymond Williams does. So when we put them together, I think we live out of our frame a lot of things. So I was interested in listening to you about the similarity, if you find some of them. Thank you. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Carla?
Should I answer now? Yeah.
Well, there's a question here. Keep that question in mind, because we are running out of time, and I don't want to lose a question that's come up in the chat either. And that's from Eduardo Ramos, asking about a gap between the late 60s, early 70s, the work of Teixeira in translating Williams, and Micheli's work in 1972. Can we say that Teixeira's preoccupation with Williams articulated to the debate on education was not successful to place Williams in this agenda? So there was clearly a period of translations there, perhaps engaging particularly with the field of education, but then a long gap that in the sense that didn't manage to gain enough traction. So perhaps deal with Anna first in relation to links with Bourdieu, and then deal with Eduardo Ramos's question regarding the sort of the gap after the early 70s.
Well, let's start with Anna's question then. Thank you for the question, Anna. I think that I'm not the most well-apt person to respond that, because I'm not this is not my subject study, but I've been reading a lot on Bourdieu and Williams, and I even sketched a paper about that, and I believe Hugo has a lot more to say about that, but I do believe there are points of interaction between them, more so than the average people would assume, because I think, and I think that using Bourdieu's theory, one can assume that because they are read in very different groups. So there's not a lot of people that read Bourdieu and Williams profoundly to make the connections. And as me and Hugo could notice in the archives, they met and they corresponded. There are some significant correspondences there. And I believe it was Bourdieu who wrote to Williams and said that he read Marxism in literature at the time, and that he felt overwhelmed by it, and he felt that he was not alone, that he was not shouting alone. So I believe that mostly the more mature Williams, as you mentioned, the more theoretical Williams, there are many connections with Bourdieu, and I believe that can be explained because they were contemporaries and they were analyzing culture in materialistic ways. Bourdieu was materialistic, and I believe that how Williams debates hegemony has to do with how Bourdieu thinks about symbolic oppression. There's a lot of parallels there. I've never dwelled much on it. I'm not an expert on the subject, but as I've been working with Bourdieu since my master's, and I do believe that they flow together, and I do believe that Bourdieu provides me with a more how can I say that without sounding like structuralist, but I think that he provides me some certainties to deal with intellectual fields that I don't know, Williams can sometimes, especially with structure of feeling, there's a lot of use in that from the intellectual history. Not a lot of use, but some use of it in the intellectual history grand area. But I believe that by mixing it, Bourdieu and Williams, there's a lot of things that can go from that. And there's a text that Williams wrote about Bourdieu, and then he states that Bourdieu rightly constructs his arguments, but he was too much of a pessimist, and Williams was more of an optimistic person. So I believe there the differences in the differences in the tones of the text, but in the end they're both searching for the same thing, in my opinion, my humble opinion.
And what about the question regarding the translations, Carla? Do you have any thoughts on that? Briefly,
yeah,
because we'll take a break.
Yeah, sorry. Eduardo, thanks for your question. I do not have a definitive answer to that yet. I noticed the fact it has come to my attention that there's this gap, and I've gathered the documents. I come to know that there's some correspondence between the publisher that published that translation and Williams's. I'm going to consult that as soon as the pandemic allows me. But I do believe that he was published, translated alongside other education authors, and other books have gained more recognition, but not culture and society. And that's a thing that is bugging me, but I do not have a satisfactory answer at the moment. But I do believe it has to do with how these books circulated